Welcome everybody. This is our third program that we've put together, the Beulah Historical Society. You're watching this because you're interested in this. You're members of the Beulah Historical Society. You found us on our website of the Beulah Historical Society, where our earlier two programs have been recorded and can be seen there. This is our third one, and I'll be introducing our guest in a moment. But I want to say a few things about the Historical Society. First, to remind you that in the newsletter are upcoming events and things of that nature, so we won't need to get into those tonight. We're more in the introduction of our guest, a special friend of mine. I'm Jeff Broom. I'm the Vice President of the Beulah Historical Society. Most of you probably know that, though. But we encourage you to share this with your friends so that others can learn about what we've done, to see our programs and come to us this way. As it has been in the past, you have come to us and you've sat down and we've given you a live program, but now in this time we are bringing the program to you, so you get to watch us from the comfort of your home. Ed Bathke is going to be giving a lecture, and I'm not going to give the title of his lecture because he'll be explaining it to you when he comes on. But if I want to give a kind of a summary of what this is about, this is fascinating because this is PowerPoint in the 19th century and the development of photography. And some of us may remember way back in the old slideshow presentations and things like this. This is pre that, but this is modern technology brought into the late 19th century and carrying on well into the 20th century. And Ed is an expert on this and has the machinery and is going to present a fine program on Colorado and photography in the slideshow or the PowerPoint, the prehistoric PowerPoint presentation that he'll give us. Ed Bathke was born and raised in Wisconsin, graduated from the University of Wisconsin in 1957, got a master's degree, came out to Colorado and started working in 1960. I believe his first job was at Martin Marietta. If you know Denver area at all, you know Titan Road down on Santa Fe. That was the Titan missiles, and that was Ed's job in Colorado. As soon as he came into Colorado with his wife Nancy, they were very, very interested in Colorado history, collected it throughout their careers. And I met Ed when I joined the Denver Westerners, a group of historians that began in 1945, and Ed joined it in 1965, and I joined it about 1998, somewhere around there. And turns out then later I was neighbors with Ed, and he would pick me up for monthly meetings and dinner talks and all that, and I got to know him and his wife quite well. Ed is a prolific collector and knowledgeable person on Colorado history. Whenever I've ever needed to know anything about Colorado history, a quick contact to Ed lets me know what I needed to know or where I needed to go to find it. I believe his collection of books on Colorado history was about 10,000. So he's got a vast collection and a vast knowledge, and it gives me great delight to introduce Ed Bathke from Roxborough, Colorado, down here to give a presentation on archaic PowerPoint. Thank you, Ed. My exit go okay?
Yeah. Lantern Slides of Colorado. Speakers like to embellish their presentations with illustrations. Surprisingly, glass plates with artistry were used as early as the 1600s, and projection optics were sufficiently good at that time to show these artistries to the audiences. Then photography appeared in 1839, and within 10 years, Langenheim produced photo images in 1848. By the end of the 19th century, audiences enjoyed the proliferating shows displaying what became known as magic lantern slides. These lantern slides continued in popularity throughout the 19th century into the 1920s. The presentation this evening will show many of these slides created between the 1890s and 1930, with a few private ones made in the 1950s. The projector tonight dates from about 1915. So our first slide is titled Colorado, but just like the old days, when we showed the movies, we had to have a few commercials. I'm Buster Brown. I live in a shoe. That's my dog Tige. He lives there too. Such went the jingle years ago, and this slide is advertising a show on June 8th. But Buster Brown shoes were what every little kid had to have in those days. Buster Brown shoes in the 20s and 30s, penny loafers in the 50s, Air Jordans in the 90s. Typical of a local advertising slide. More butter, please. Advertising Mountain Gold butter, which was produced by the Walsenburg Creamery. We'll take a tour of Colorado, and we'll start in Denver. Here we have a downtown view. You'll notice a gold dome building in the background. That's not the Capitol. However, it's the Arapahoe County Courthouse. Denver at that time was part of Arapahoe County. But here is the Denver Capitol with its gold dome. And of course, to the left in the foreground is the Pioneer Monument. If we stay in Denver, I'm sure we'll pick one of the finest hotels in town, the Brown Palace. And for entertainment, what better than the Tabor Opera House? We'll take a tour around Denver. Here in our touring car, we pause at Denver City Park. And now, if we leave Denver, we'll have to use the finest in transportation, the railroads, and we go to Denver Union Station. We head north, across out on the plains of Colorado. Here's our train chugging along. At this time, the railroads represented the finest in entertainment. This is typical in this fine railroad car, this plush palace car. And the Colorado economy, of course, was tied to railroads. Here we have a freight train. It's in Platte Canyon, just south of Denver. Recreation and tourism also thrived with the trains. Here the Colorado Midland Railway ran a flower excursion out of Colorado Springs. The Moffett Road crossed the Continental Divide on Rollins Pass. One of our first stops after leaving Denver will be Boulder. This is the Boulder Sanitarium, a well-known institution in Boulder in those days, which cared for many invalids. Originally, Boulder was quite a mining community. In the county, there were a lot of mining camps. This is typical of one of them. This is Caribou. It's just a little bit northwest of Nederland. This is in its thriving days in the 1880s. Today you can visit the site and you'll find only a few foundations. Out on the plains, agriculture dominated. In the early 1900s, the state of Colorado was a major producer of sugar beets, and here the farmers are bringing their loads and dumping them into the rail cars. Not all lantern slides were produced by professional photographers and sold commercially. In the period of about 1915 to 1925, the Colorado Superintendent of Schools, Mrs. Johnson, made slides of school activities in northeastern Colorado. This is the Grover School with its buses in front. And here we have the West Pawnee Consolidated School. But small one-teacher schools still existed, and here we have the entire class out in front. The buses at the Carly School are all lined up, ready to start. Mrs. Johnson also photographed activities. Here's the girls' calisthenics class in the gymnasium at Meade. And at the Pickery Consolidated School, the girls are outside playing basketball. I particularly enjoy this slide since note the photographer caught the basketball in midair. One more school activity. This is the Yuma football team. And in 1921, the Yuma boys were the Northeast Colorado champs. We'll head for scenery. Here's Estes Park. Although it's quite small and difficult for the viewer to see on a screen, at the bottom it says, Switzerland? No, Colorado. And this was an advertising slide used by the Burlington Railroad. And while we're in Estes Park, we could possibly stay at the Estes Park Hotel. This was a photograph by the noted pioneer photographer William Henry Jackson. Or perhaps we'd want to stay at a dude ranch. Here's the Steed Ranch and Hotel, boasting of all of its particular facilities for the tourist. And the accommodations around Estes Park were certainly luxurious. Here's a fine dining room. We'll journey into Rocky Mountain National Park. Here we are on the Fall River Road. Driving the road, we make it to the top, the Fall River Pass. And people here are recording their accomplishment, although I wish they would have been looking just a tad happier. Having been up there though, I'm sure it was a cold day and a bit windy besides. Or for the more adventurous, you could always climb Long's Peak. Here I am on the Keyhole route, back on the west side of Long's Peak. Well, I was there a few years later, but I have been at that point. It's exciting. Back on the road, the railroad that is, here the train is going up Clear Creek Canyon. And our next stop our train pulls into Central City. And while we're in Central City, we can take in a little entertainment. Here's the Tiller House, top entertainment since the 1890s, and of course still active today. This particular photo, incidentally, was taken on July 1st, 1950. Nearby to Central City, the next little town, Black Hawk. An earlier view, pre-casino of course. Now we'll head a little further south and west. We pass through Georgetown, and the next town is Silver Plume. We're heading towards Loveland Pass. But on our way, we'll take a little side excursion. We'll climb 2 more of Colorado's 14ers. Here we are on Gray's and Torrey's peaks. We cross the pass. Next town, Breckenridge. This obtained from a very early photograph, dates to about the 1860s, the very beginning of Breckenridge. Of course, crossing the Continental Divide is always something to celebrate, and here the whole gang is gathering around the sign. Next, the 2-mile-high city, Leadville. And landscape around Leadville, nothing but mines. Nearby, a famous scenic attraction, Mount of the Holy Cross. This photo first taken by William Henry Jackson in 1873. Then 20 years later, Jackson returns. There's Mount of the Holy Cross in the background, and on the rock here, this is on Notch Mountain for the view, is Jackson's son Clarence. The Great Silver Camp, Aspen. And on the edge of Aspen, the major mine producing all that silver was the Smuggler. Nearby Aspen, one of the little mining camps was Ashcroft. Here we see an abandoned store building. It started to decay over the years. However, it has been renovated. We've added logs on the bottom, and you can still see the building today. Leaving Aspen, we'll pause and enjoy the hot pool at Glenwood Springs. Seeing the sights on the western slope. Oop. We head to the Switzerland of America and the San Juans, Ouray. Oh, there's the slide I was looking for. This is also a western slope view, actually in Routt County, where we have a hunter's cabin. In the area we have, between Montrose and Gunnison, we pause and we just happen to catch President Taft opening the Gunnison Tunnel in 1908. In the Ouray area, one of the major mines was the Campbird. It was the mine owned by Thomas Walsh, where he made his millions, including enough money that he was known for having purchased the Hope Diamond. And typical of all the mining operations in Ouray, in this mill, we see a gold concentrator table. We head south out of Ouray on the $1 Million Highway. Still looks quite a bit the same today. A great trip to take flatland tourists on and give them a thrill. Along the road, one of the old mining camps, Red Mountain Town. Today there are just a few decaying cabins left. And then on into Silverton. As we head down Main Street, we meet a mule train coming in. Of the many mining camps in the San Juans, here we have Creed, as the famous Colorado poet Cy Warman wrote, "It's day all day in the daytime, and there is no night in Creed. It was one wild town." This is Carson City in the San Juans, and there are still a few cabins remaining there today, but of course not the mining boom town it once was. We look for some scenery next, popular tourist destination, and it's Mesa Verde with the Cliff Palace ruins. And here just happen to be a couple of those tourists in Mesa Verde. Southwestern Colorado, the major town, Durango. Not only a railroad town, but it was well known as a smelter town, and in the background you can see the smoke from some of those smelters. Returning, our train pauses on Marshall Pass inside the snow shed. We continue our train journey, and here we're entering the Royal Gorge. While in the gorge, we'll pause at the famous hanging bridge for a little photo opportunity, and there right in the middle, joining us, happens to be President Teddy Roosevelt in the top hat. Well, it's angled a little bit northward. We're the world's greatest gold camp, Cripple Creek, founded by kind of a ne'er-do-well cowboy, Bob Womack. Bob really didn't make that much money at the Cripple Creek, enough for a few more visits to the bar, and then he sort of disappears. However, one of the famous millionaires that Cripple Creek made was Winfield Scott Stratton, who was famous for his Independence mine. And typical of all those mining operations, here's a miner working at the Nightingale mine in Cripple Creek. But while we're there at Cripple Creek, we will have to remember the Great Fire in 1896, which really destroyed most of the town at that time. From Cripple Creek, we'll head down Ute Pass. Here we're passing through Woodland Park with Pikes Peak in the background. Coming down Ute Pass, well, this is just a little bit earlier. This freight train being in the 1880s, more likely will again be on our train. Here's the Midland Terminal Railway coming down Ute Pass. Before we get into town, we can take a little side trip. Here's a tour bus going up Pikes Peak. It's just entering the W's, the famous switchback on the north side of Pikes Peak. This slide is, of course, an advertising slide by the First National Bank. Or we could drive up the peak ourselves, taking the Pikes Peak Auto Highway. Still one more option, the Cog Railway. Here's our little cog engine, which will take us to the top, taking us to the Summit House and the old signal station. Then coming down Pikes Peak, we get to Manitou Springs. And Manitou, of course, was known for its many mineral springs. And this view being approximately the 1880s. In Manitou, we can take advantage of the many fine accommodations. This is the Cliff House, one of the earliest and one of the finest hotels, and still in existence today as an upscale B&B. Nearby are the Indian ruins. These are not originals. Some were purchased on other land in Colorado and moved in, and some were constructed replicas. Nearby, of course, the famous park of the Colorado Springs, Garden of the Gods, with the #1 view, the Gateway Rocks, with Pikes Peak in the background. On into Colorado Springs in around 1900, with Pikes Peak as a backdrop. While we're in Colorado Springs, perhaps we could stay at the Antlers Hotel. This is the first Antlers. It was constructed in 1882, but it burned spectacularly in 1898. In 1901, the second Antlers opened. Unfortunately, it was razed in 1964. And in a Colorado Springs Park, this is labeled the Old Capitol Building. This was one of the original cabins in Colorado Springs, and the legislature did hold its meetings the very first year in this area. Unfortunately, it's since been proven that it was not in this particular building. Heading south, we pass through Canyon City. Just on the other side of the state penitentiary, here is the Spring House and the little stone tower on the hill. We enter Pueblo in its earlier days. And Pueblo a couple decades later. Of course, the mainstay of Pueblo in those days was the steel mills. But we could spend some time in the Mineral Palace Park in Pueblo, in which were statues of King Coal and Queen Silver. Unfortunately, the Mineral Palace was destroyed in the 1930s as a WPA project. Well, touring the town, we won't have time to get much further south to visit such spots as Trinidad. Instead, we'll head towards the Wet Mountain Valley. And here in the distance, we see Westcliff. And nearby, we'll pass through the mining camp of Rosita. This is Rosita in its heyday in the 1880s. As we've toured the state, we really should pay some homage to its original inhabitants, the Native Americans, the Utes. Also prominent in the development of the state was the cowboy. And here the cowboys are around the campfire with the chuck wagon in the background. And of course, just as prominent in the development of the state was mining. Here's a rather extensive mining operation, and they've got all their Broncos lined up getting a drink. But a lot of those mines were the discoveries of the prospector, and he had to use his stalwart burro getting to the hills to find those claims. Some of the wildlife of our great state, the Colorado buffalo. A mountain lion, but as we can see, this one was just chained up as a tourist attraction. And a little bear cub up on his hind legs taking a drink, again at a tourist site. Well, for entertainment, there's always a nice card game going. But besides those boys having fun, there had to be somebody in the office doing a little work. Sure wish I had a desk like that now. Well, as we draw to a close on the end of this show, we'll have to have a preview of coming attractions. I think we will want to see D.W. Griffith in Scarlet Days, A Tale of the Old West. Or here's one I'm sure you won't want to miss, Will Rogers in Doubling for Romeo. You look at who's starring in it, Elmer Rice, Will Rogers, and William Shakespeare. And underneath he has written, one of these boys was famous. With that, we draw to a close with the Colorado state flower, the columbine.
And now, on with the show.
Thank you for joining me tonight in presenting these slides. Among the questions I've received here, probably the first one I should start with is, how did I get interested in collecting the slides? Well, it all started back in 1960 when I came to Colorado, and my wife was teaching third grade in Jefferson County, and one of her third graders' mothers invited us to a meeting of the Colorado Ghost Town Club. Both my wife and I had always been interested in history, so we enjoyed learning more about the history of Colorado. We started collecting books, photos, anything with historical information about Colorado. So that meant for photos, the earlier photos were generally on stereo view cards, or there were often images printed on heavy cards that were like 5 by 8 inches. But gradually I ran across some of these glass slides too, and they were the same kind of information, telling me about Colorado history. So I've collected quite a few other lantern slides anytime I see them. Find them primarily in antique shows, some antique shops, and of course now you can also find them on the internet. They tend to be not as interesting a collectible as paper photos, because not everybody has got a projector like I have to really use them. But they're still available. There's a minor amount of collecting them. Let's see, glancing at other collections here. Yes, these are all glass slides. They're actually just like a photo is printed from the negative on sensitized paper, you have the right chemicals on a sheet of glass to sensitize it to get that image produced on it, just like you would in a paper photo. But then there is another thin layer of glass put on it so to protect it. So these are really, here's one, for example, of one of the lantern slides. I'll have to check over here in the computer. Somebody was asking about old steam engines. In Colorado, there's a Colorado Railroad Museum. It's on 44th Avenue as you head out of Lakewood going to Golden. And many states have sort of a state railroad museum. The ones in Nevada, California, Pennsylvania are particularly good ones that I visited. In Colorado, if you go out there on 44th, I think you'll be quite impressed with how much rolling stock they have. They even have some locomotives that are operating and they can run rides periodically. Okay, let's see what else. As far as maintaining the slides, they're all in drawers. So, you know, they aren't out where sunlight can fade them or anything like that. And it's quite interesting. One of the big producers of photos in this era was the Keystone View Company. And they were in Pennsylvania, but their entire collection, including negatives, is all out in the California State Photo Museum now. And they were primarily stereo view makers, but they made a set of 600 views with matching lantern slides. They were all world history and world geography, and they the 600 slides, glass slides, the 600 stereo views were all in an oak cabinet. It's a stacked oak cabinet. These, of course, are fairly rare. I happen to have one downstairs, and that's where I keep my lantern slides. Somebody's asking what my Colorado consists of. Well, anything that pertains to Colorado history is attractive, and especially as information. So number one, books. Number two, photos. But there are other things, you know, you wind up collecting, let's say, railroad passes. There are many souvenirs produced. Sterling silver souvenir spoons were very popular starting in the 1890s, and this continued up into the 1920s. My wife started collecting these. I joined in with her. So of course we've got a massive number of spoons that show some. Okay, there, I think I got reconnected. Things dropped out for a while. Modern electronics for 19th century material. Might show one other thing. Back in the late 19th century, there were lantern slides that were driven with a little kerosene light before the electric bulb was invented. And here, for example, is a little piece of, this is a lantern slide. These often had children's stories or nursery rhymes on them. This one happens to be scenes in the US West. And this little strip has about 4 scenes on it. But then once the electric bulb was invented, then we had better illumination for presenting something like a lantern slide. And you might wonder what is the power for the projector I use. This is the bulb. It's a 400-watt bulb. It's also a stage light used in the theater, which means then they're still available. So if I burn it out on my projector, I can get a replacement. Somebody asked, what's the oldest slide? Probably made in the 1890s, although one could take an earlier photograph. For example, that Breckenridge photo was a scene from about the 1860s. And I had friends, other Colorado historians, who back in the 1950s took some of the earliest photos from the 1860s, 70s, and 80s of Colorado and made lantern slides out of them just for a show like this. Not sure if I've covered every question here. Hope so. I don't know. Are there any other questions? I think that about covers it for questions then. I appreciate you all joining me tonight. I've certainly enjoyed presenting it for you.
Well, thank you for being with us tonight and sharing a very interesting story about Colorado history and history of cameras and that sort of thing. Thank you to Ed Bathke for coming down from the metro area of Denver to give of his time and share of his wisdom in this and his knowledge. Thank you for Chad Perkins for the production of this. Thank you, Greta, for organizing the Beulah Historical Society as it is. And thank you for the creativity of all of those who have been involved to produce these programs. This is our third one, and we plan on many more. So we like this. We'd like to ask you to share with us anything that can help us to do anything better. And to bring, please share this with people outside of the Beulah community. But understand that this is first and foremost about the Beulah Valley and our love of this history here, and especially your interest in watching this. So thank you very much, and you all have a good day. Bye.